Hey everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Ashley Zahn, and I am the Director of Curriculum here at C2 Education. Today, we're going to talk about the things you can do to boost your SAT or ACT scores this spring. Remember, if you have questions during the presentation, please put them in the chat box, and we'll get to as many as we can after the presentation. Let's get started by talking about why the SAT and ACT are important. Even though a lot of colleges remain test optional, the SAT and ACT are still very relevant from an admissions perspective. Many selective colleges have begun requiring test scores again, from MIT to Stanford to the Ivies. Test-required policies are becoming the norm again at elite schools. SAT scores also matter for scholarships. A lot of merit-based awards still use test scores alongside grades to evaluate academic strength. And finally, placement. Many colleges use SAT or ACT scores to decide where students start academically, which can affect course selection right out of the gate. Before we talk about how to prepare for the SAT or the ACT, we need to talk about the tests themselves, because today's tests are not the tests that most parents might remember. We'll start with the SAT. The SAT is now fully digital. There is no paper version unless a student has accommodations. It is also adaptive, which means how a student performs early on in each section influences what comes next, and it's shorter at about 2 hours and 15 minutes. That doesn't mean it's easier. It just means there's less room for wasted time or unfocused work. These shifts in format directly influence the strategies that students need in order to maximize their scores. The SAT has two sections, reading and writing, and math. Each section has two modules. Reading and writing has 27 questions in 32 minutes per module, and math has 22 questions in 35 minutes per module. The pacing isn't frantic, but the questions demand thought. This, in many ways, is a test of problem solving. Now, before we move on, take a look at this graph. Notice that the green bars representing the minutes per section are all a decent bit longer than the red ones representing the number of questions. That's going to be important in just a moment. The SAT is scored from 400 to 1,600 points. Each section is worth a maximum of 800 points, and the section scores are added to get the total score. The ACT, on the other hand, can be taken digitally or on paper. It is not an adaptive test, so difficulty is predetermined. The enhanced ACT is shorter than the old test, though not by much. If you take the optional science section, and we generally recommend that you do, the test comes in at about 2 hours and 45 minutes long. The ACT has 4 sections: English, math, reading, and the optional science section. Now, remember how I said that the SAT version of this graph would be important. On the SAT, you have more minutes than questions by a decent bit across all sections. On the ACT, that's not the case. What this means is that the ACT is much more of a sprint than the SAT. On the English section, for instance, you have under a minute per question on the ACT. Another key thing to note about the ACT is the number of unscored items on the test. Both the SAT and the ACT have unscored items. These are experimental questions that the test makers use in order to calibrate and refine future tests. On the SAT, there are 2 totally random questions on each module, or about 8% of the total questions you'll see on the test. On the ACT, that proportion is far higher. Across the entire test, over 15% of ACT questions won't be counted. Within each section, that varies dramatically. On the reading section, for example, a full quarter of the questions, an entire passage worth, won't be scored. And you have no way of predicting which questions count and which ones don't. Why is that important? Well, let's consider reading. Only 27 of the 36 questions are scored. That means that missing just one reading question could drop your reading score by more than a full point. On the ACT in particular, unscored questions leave you with little room for error, and if you're looking for a top score, you have to be practically perfect. The ACT is scored from 1 to 36 points. The composite score is the average of your performance on English, math, and reading. Science, if you take it, is reported as a separate score. But the question that most people have about scores is, what's a good score? And the honest answer is, it depends on your goals. Let's look at SAT scores. Nationwide, an average score is somewhere in the range of 840 to 1260. This is where the majority of test takers fall. Above average scores land in the mid-1200s to the mid-1400s, and students targeting highly selective schools will usually need scores in the upper 1400s or higher. A score is only meaningful in context. What would be considered a good score for one school might not be competitive at all for another school. So, how do you reach those elite scores? The SAT and ACT test patterns, not tricks. Scores improve when students become familiar with how the test works and apply clear strategies consistently. That combination, familiarity plus strategy, is where points come from. Score jumps begin with clarity, which is why it's a good idea to always begin with a diagnostic test. Any good test prep plan starts with a diagnostic. After all, you can't plan a journey if you don't know where you're starting from. The diagnostic isn't about pressure, it's about clarity. Guessing wastes time. Data gives us direction. A diagnostic test gives you a baseline to work from. It'll tell you your total current score and the balance in your performance across sections. For example, this SAT student has a fairly average score and seems to be a little stronger on the verbal side than on the math side. A diagnostic should not be a stressful experience because the score is all about providing direction, not judgment. A diagnostic will also show you your broad strengths and weaknesses. For instance, this student's relatively low score on the geometry and trigonometry questions could suggest that this would be an area in need of additional support during SAT prep. The testing experience itself will also help to determine whether there might be an issue with timing. For example, if you felt rushed or were unable to complete each section, and whether you feel comfortable with the format of the test. But what a diagnostic cannot do is show you exactly what you should be studying or skipping. This is especially true on the SAT. Because the test is adaptive, there's a lot of variability in what you might see on a single exam. Question difficulty and the spread of topics can vary from test to test. And that's why the diagnostic test informs the plan. It is not the plan. Once you've established your baseline and considered your goals, then we start to figure out how to maximize achievement on your timeline. When creating a prep plan, the first thing to consider is how much time to dedicate to test prep. The short answer, more time gives you greater opportunity. Let's take a look at what could be accomplished on some different timelines. A short timeline, like for those who are taking tests in April or May, is going to allow for content review targeted to those highest impact gaps, strategy and pacing work to refine your timing and familiarity with the test format. But this is not full mastery. It's really more like triage. A somewhat longer timeline, like for those who are testing in the summer, allows for addressing foundational gaps, more exposure to test-style practice questions, and the time to apply feedback and adjust. Learning sticks because there's greater repetition and review, and improvement becomes more reliable. But the students who get the most out of test prep are the ones who start early and give themselves multiple testing opportunities. A longer timeline allows for true content mastery. It allows the opportunity for multiple practice and official tests, and it gives greater long-term benefits. Confidence comes from repetition and success over time. This is how students reach their full potential. Test prep is a marathon, not a sprint. Granted, even short timelines can be productive when used wisely. The next component of our score jump blueprint is to focus on high-impact topics. We'll start by going section by section. When we talk about improving reading scores, the first step is understanding what the test is actually asking you to do. The reading section isn't random. It's built around predictable question types. Once you recognize those patterns, the test becomes much more manageable. You'll see main idea and detail questions, which ask you to identify the central claim or locate specific support in the passage. These reward careful reading and precision. You'll also see function or purpose questions. These ask why the author included something, why a sentence, paragraph, or example is there. That requires thinking about structure and authorial intent, not just content. Inference questions are about reading between the lines. They're not guessing, they're drawing logical conclusions based strictly on the evidence in the passage. Vocabulary and context questions test whether you understand how a word is being used in that specific situation. It's less about memorized definitions and more about meaning within the sentence. And finally, evidence questions ask you to identify the proof behind an answer. The SAT in particular loves pairing reasoning with support. When you know these categories ahead of time, you can approach test questions much more strategically. One of the most underrated ways to improve reading scores is so simple. Read more. And not just novels assigned in class. Read editorials, read science writing, read historical speeches, read long-form journalism. Expose yourself to structured arguments and formal tone. Honestly, it really doesn't matter what you read as long as you're reading actively and consistently. Passive reading won't move the needle. You have to read with intent. That means tracking the author's argument. What's the main claim? How is it supported? What's the tone? Where is the strongest evidence? And every so often, stop and check yourself. Can you summarize what you just read? Could you explain the author's position to someone else? This kind of intentional reading builds the exact muscle the SAT and ACT tests, comprehension under structure. Practice alone doesn't raise scores, review does. So after every question, especially on the reading section, ask yourself 3 questions. First, why is the right answer right? Not just because the explanation says so. What specific line in the passage proves it? Second, why is the wrong answer tempting? Test makers design distractors very carefully. Usually they are partly correct, or slightly exaggerated, or missing a key word. Understanding why you fell for something is how you stop falling for it again. Third, what specific clue did I miss? Was it a transition word, a contrast, a qualifier like primarily or most likely? When you consistently analyze your mistakes this way, patterns start to appear. And once you recognize patterns, improvement accelerates. Pattern recognition is the key. Tests are predictable. The students who score highest are the ones who learn to see those patterns clearly. Now let's talk about test flow, because how a test feels while you're taking it matters just as much as what it's testing. If you're taking the SAT, you're going to notice shorter passages and quicker transitions. You'll answer a few questions, then immediately shift to a new topic. Every question has its own passage, and that means you have to be able to reset your brain fast. You don't get to settle into one long reading experience. You have to stay flexible, focused, and ready to pivot. The SAT rewards precision. You need to process efficiently, adjust quickly, and avoid getting stuck. If you're taking the ACT, the experience is very different. You'll read longer passages, and the order is predictable. You know what's coming next. But here's the trade-off. You'll feel more time pressure. You're moving quickly through a lot of questions tied to one long text. The ACT rewards pacing, discipline, and endurance. You have to maintain focus over longer stretches and manage the clock more carefully. Neither test is harder, they just challenge you in different ways. On the SAT, you need agility and quick analytical shifts. On the ACT, you need stamina and strong time management. When you understand how your test flows before you walk in on test day, you're not caught off guard. You're prepared for the rhythm. And when you're prepared for the rhythm, your performance improves. On both the ACT and the SAT, grammar makes up about half of the English questions on the test. That's actually good news for you because grammar relies on straightforward rules, no mysteries. Both tests consistently check the same core grammar skills, and if you master them, you stop guessing and start choosing answers with confidence. First, subject-verb agreement. You need to make sure your verb matches your true subject, not the word sitting right next to it. The tests love to insert extra phrases to distract you. Your job is to strip the sentence down and identify the real subject. Next, verb tenses. You have to keep time consistent. If a sentence starts in the past, you can't randomly jump to the present unless there's a clear reason. You should always ask yourself, does this tense match the timeline of the passage? Modifiers are another major category. If a descriptive phrase is in the wrong place, it can accidentally describe the wrong thing. When you read a sentence, check that every modifier clearly connects to what it's supposed to be describing. Parallel structure shows up constantly. If a sentence lists items or actions, they need to match grammatically. If it starts with running, swimming, and, the third item better match that pattern. And finally, punctuation rules. Commas, semicolons, colons, dashes. These aren't stylistic choices on the test. They follow strict rules. If you know when a clause is independent or dependent, punctuation questions become mechanical. Here's the key. On this section, you are not being asked what sounds better. You're being asked what follows the rule. When you know the rule, these become some of the fastest points that you can earn. The other half of the writing questions on the SAT and ACT are about writing quality, and this is where you have to start thinking like an editor. When you see a sentence, don't just read it. Ask yourself, why is this sentence here? Is it providing evidence, giving an example, introducing a counterargument, adding background? Both the SAT and ACT test your ability to recognize purpose. You'll also see questions asking what improves clarity. That means you're choosing the option that's the most direct, the least redundant, and the easiest to understand. Wordy answers are rarely correct. Clear writing usually wins. And then there's organization. You might be asked where a sentence belongs or what transition best connects ideas. In those moments, zoom out. Think about the paragraph as a whole. What's the main idea? What's the logical order? Strong writing isn't random, it flows. When you approach these questions, stop focusing on individual words and start thinking about structure and purpose. When you understand what the author is trying to do, the correct answer becomes much more obvious. For most students, grammar is one of the biggest weaknesses on these tests. And that's an opportunity because grammar is rule-based, so it's one of the fastest areas to improve. If you struggle in math or reading, those gains often take time. But if you systematically learn grammar rules and practice applying them, you can see point increases fairly quickly. That's what we mean by low-hanging fruit. If you commit to mastering core grammar rules, really mastering them, you give yourself a built-in score boost on either test. You don't need tricks. You don't need shortcuts. You need clarity on the rules and repetition in applying them. When you turn grammar from a weakness into a strength, you create faster point gains and more confidence walking into test day. And confidence matters. When it comes to math on the SAT or ACT, your foundation matters more than anything else. Both tests build upward. If your core algebra is shaky, everything on top of it becomes harder than it needs to be. So start with linear equations. You need to be completely comfortable solving them, graphing them, interpreting slope and intercepts, and understanding what they mean in context. Linear relationships show up everywhere. Next, systems of equations. You should be able to solve them algebraically and understand what the solution represents. Substitution and elimination shouldn't slow you down. They should feel automatic. Quadratics are another major category. Factoring, using the quadratic formula, understanding the vertex, recognizing when an equation has no real solutions. These are standard expectations on both tests. And then ratios and percent change. These show up constantly, especially in word problems. If you hesitate when you see percentages, that hesitation costs you time. Here's the truth. Advanced math questions depend on basic algebra skills. If you strengthen the foundation, the harder questions become manageable instead of overwhelming. A lot of students think that because they're in calculus, they're automatically strong in math. And that might be true, but it doesn't necessarily translate to test scores. On both the SAT and ACT, the math content is mostly algebra and foundational topics. So if you haven't used certain skills in over a year, you may feel rusty, even if you're advanced in school. It's common for calculus students to struggle with algebra simplification, factoring, or manipulating expressions quickly. So if you haven't worked with certain topics recently, it's time to brush up. Review exponent rules, review factoring, review solving systems without overcomplicating them. Test math isn't about the most advanced topic you've ever taken. It's about how efficiently and accurately you can apply core skills. If you tighten up older material, you often see immediate improvement. There are also specific advanced topics that tend to trip students up. Trigonometry is one of them. You need to know basic trig ratios, understand the unit circle, and apply trig in context. These questions aren't usually impossible, but they do require familiarity. Advanced algebra is another. This includes manipulating complex expressions, working with functions, understanding transformations, and solving nonlinear equations. And then there's multi-step modeling. These are the questions where you have to translate a real-world scenario into math before you even start solving anything. They test whether you understand what the question is asking, not just whether you can compute. If these areas feel shaky, don't ignore them. Get targeted help. Work through structured practice. Break the problems down step by step. Avoiding advanced topics doesn't make them go away on test day. Finally, let's talk about repeated mistakes. A lot of lost points don't come from not knowing the material. They come from patterns. Careless errors like miscopying a number, dropping a negative sign, or misreading a question add up fast. Misreading constraints is another big one. The question says positive integer and you ignore that restriction, you can easily pick a technically correct but invalid answer. And algebra slips, small simplification mistakes, often happen when you rush. You need to start identifying your patterns. Are you consistently making sign errors? Are you rushing through the last few questions? Are you skipping steps in your work? Improvement in math isn't just about learning new content. It's about eliminating repeat mistakes. When you clear up your patterns, your score rises, even without learning anything new. Now that you know what to practice, let's talk about how to practice. What actually moves scores is practice, but, and this is key, it's not about more practice, it's about better practice. That means mastering core knowledge by understanding the concepts on the test and not by memorizing isolated tricks. Fixing repeat mistakes by identifying patterns and errors so that you're correcting root causes and not just symptoms. Refining timing and strategy so that you know when to move on and can leverage your knowledge of the test, and using practice tests as check-ins to refine your strategies. It's not enough to just do a lot of practice questions. You have to use them the right way. This means targeting practice so that it's focused on current learning goals. We practice with intent, not just volume. Understanding why answers are right. It's not enough to just review questions you got wrong, because knowing why something works makes it repeatable. Aiming for concept mastery so you aren't stacking new material on shaky foundations. And incorporating test-taking strategies into your practice so that you learn when to skip, eliminate, or move on test day. Most of your test prep should involve practice questions rather than full-length practice tests. Practice tests are best used strategically. On a single test, you're usually only going to see a small handful of questions on any given topic. You might see just a single question on a certain topic. Getting that question right doesn't mean you mastered the topic, and getting it wrong doesn't mean the topic is a weakness. Over-reliance on practice tests results in reactive prep, which is what we try to avoid. This happens when students take too many practice tests in too short a span of time. Each practice test appears to reveal a new weakness, so the student jumps to this new topic. The cycle keeps repeating itself with each new test, resulting in constant reaction instead of steady improvement. This can feel productive, but it isn't. Instead, tests should be used sparingly and strategically. They're checkpoints, not the roadmap. Just as important as knowing what does work is knowing what doesn't work. Drill and kill prep, doing lots of practice without slowing down to understand what's happening, might give you some quick gains, but scores quickly flatten and progress stalls. Sporadic prep is too inconsistent. These tests reward cumulative skill building, and students need repetition and reinforcement to see real progress. And content blind prep, which relies on shortcuts or tricks without strong content knowledge, is also to be avoided. Without a strong knowledge foundation, strategies break down on harder questions, hindering student progress. The last pillar in our blueprint is to refine your pacing. Knowing the content is only half the battle. You also have to be able to move quickly through the test, especially on the ACT. If you don't know your time benchmarks, pacing becomes guesswork. Let's look at reading as an example. On the SAT reading and writing section, you have just over a minute per question. That doesn't mean you rush every question. It means you stay aware. If you're spending 3 or 4 minutes on one problem, you're borrowing time from future questions. On the ACT reading section, you think in terms of passage blocks. You get about 10 minutes per passage, and that includes reading and answering all 9 questions that go with it. That means you cannot casually reread paragraphs over and over. You need a plan. When you know the numbers ahead of time, you stop being surprised by the clock. You start managing it intentionally. Timing shouldn't control you. You should control it. Pacing also depends on understanding how each test is structured. Let's look at a couple of examples. On both the SAT and ACT, math questions generally increase in difficulty throughout each section. That means that you should expect later questions to take more time. Don't panic when they get harder, that's by design. On the SAT reading and writing section, questions move from easier to harder within groups of similar question types. So when you notice a jump in difficulty, that's normal. It doesn't mean you're suddenly struggling, it means the test is escalating. On the ACT reading section, passage type matters. Some students naturally find science passages easier. Others prefer literary narrative or social science. If you know your strength, you can choose orders strategically. Understanding the structure helps you make smarter pacing decisions. When you know what's coming, you stay calmer and more deliberate. One of the biggest pacing mistakes you can make is refusing to move on. You need a skip strategy. If a question is confusing after a reasonable attempt, flag it and move forward. Both the SAT and ACT will allow you to return to questions within a section. Use that. Don't let one stubborn question steal 5 minutes from you. 5 minutes is multiple other questions that you could have answered correctly. Skipping is not quitting. It's strategic time management. When you move on quickly and return later with a fresh perspective, you often solve the question faster anyway. Your goal is maximizing total points, not proving you can conquer every problem in order. You cannot expect to pace well on test day if you've never practiced under time pressure. Start with short drills. Set a timer for 10 minutes and work through a small set of questions. Get used to feeling the clock without freezing. But don't make everything timed. Layer your practice. First, build accuracy without time pressure, learn the skills, fix the mistakes, slow down when you need to, and then introduce timing. Add constraints once your foundation is solid. If you only practice untimed, the clock will shock you. If you only practice timed, your accuracy may never improve. So balance both. Pacing is a skill, and like any skill, it improves with intentional, structured practice. Let's bring everything together. Score jumps don't happen because you try harder. They happen because you follow a structure. You start with a diagnostic. You get real data about where you stand, not guesses and not assumptions. Then you establish your timeline. You're honest about when you're testing and how much time you have. Your plan matches your reality. Next, you focus on high-impact areas. You don't try to fix everything at once. You target the skills that move points: grammar rules, algebra foundations, reading patterns, pacing mistakes. And then you practice effectively. That means reviewing mistakes, fixing patterns, balancing timed and untimed work, building accuracy before chasing speed. And finally, you refine your pacing. You learn your time benchmarks, develop a skip strategy. You stop letting one hard question derail your entire section. That's the blueprint. It's simple, it's structured, and it works. If you follow these steps consistently, your score doesn't rise by accident. It rises because you built your process that way. Now the question becomes, what does it look like to follow this blueprint with real support? Experienced prep isn't random worksheets. It isn't just taking practice test after practice test and hoping something sticks. It starts with a breadth of curriculum. You need access to enough material to see patterns, to practice weaknesses repeatedly, and to grow beyond just a small recycled question set. Second, it's flexible and adaptive. You don't improve evenly. Some weeks, math clicks. Other weeks, reading needs more attention. Effective prep adjusts with you. It follows your progress, not a rigid script. And third, it includes expert support. You need instructors who understand both content and strategy, not just how to solve the problem, but how to approach the test. Because this exam isn't just about knowledge, it's about application under pressure. When you combine structure, flexibility, and expertise, you don't just prepare, you improve. And that's the difference between studying and training. If you commit to the blueprint and surround yourself with the right support, your score jump isn't a possibility, it's a process. Thank you so much for attending tonight's webinar. Stick around for our live Q&A session. Go ahead and start putting your questions in the chat now.